In the winter of 1636, a single tulip bulb sold for more than a skilled carpenter earned in a year. That number gets repeated often, and it is roughly accurate. What gets left out is almost everything else. The tulip mania story has been told so many times in so many economics lectures that the actual mechanism, how it worked, who was involved, why it happened, has been almost completely buried under the legend. The popular version goes like this. Ordinary Dutch people lost their minds over flowers. Prices went vertical, then the market collapsed, and thousands were ruined. That version is satisfying, and mostly wrong. To understand what actually happened in the Dutch Republic in the 1630s, you have to start not with greed, but with a flower that did something strange. The tulip arrived in the Dutch Republic via Ottoman trade routes in the late 16th century. It was already expensive before speculation began, a luxury import, not a common garden plant. But then certain tulip bulbs started doing something no one could fully explain at the time. They broke. Not physically. The bulb itself looked normal from the outside. But when the flower opened, instead of a solid color, it displayed dramatic streaks and flames of contrasting pigment. A red tulip might bloom with white feathering along each petal. A purple variety might split into violet and cream in unpredictable patterns. These were called broken tulips, and they were considered the most beautiful things in the Republic. Florists, which at the time meant tulip traders, not flower shop owners, priced them accordingly. What no one in the 1630s understood was that the breaking was caused by a virus. The mosaic virus, transmitted by aphids, infected the bulb and altered how it expressed pigment. A broken tulip could not reliably reproduce its own pattern. Its offsets, the small daughter bulbs it produced, might break the same way, or might not. This made every truly spectacular broken tulip effectively unique and unreproducible on demand. The rarest varieties, Semper Augustus, Viceroy, Admiral van Enkhuizen, became objects of obsession among collectors. Semper Augustus, with its white petals streaked in red and violet, was reportedly owned by a single collector for years, who refused repeated offers to sell it. Contemporary accounts suggest it sold for sums that matched the price of a canal house in Amsterdam. Whether those specific figures are precise is debated. Records from this period are inconsistent, but the general scale of high-end tulip valuations is documented in merchant account books and correspondence. What matters is that this top-tier market was small, exclusive, and involved serious collectors and wealthy merchants. It was not a mass market, not yet. The shift that turned tulip collecting into something resembling a speculative market happened gradually through the mid-1630s. Part of it was cultural. The Dutch Republic in this period was extraordinarily prosperous. The Dutch East India Company had restructured global trade. Amsterdam was the financial capital of Europe. There was surplus wealth moving through the merchant class. And flowers were an established status good. But the more important shift was structural, and it had less to do with flowers than with contracts. By 1636, tulip trading had moved beyond the exchange of actual bulbs. Traders began buying and selling tulips that were still in the ground. A buyer would sign a contract agreeing to purchase a specific bulb at a specific price when it was lifted in summer. The seller would pocket a deposit now and deliver the bulb months later. This was a futures contract, not an invention of the tulip market, but borrowed from existing commodity trading. Grain, herring, and spices had been traded this way in the Republic for decades. The tulip market adopted the structure, but with one important difference. Tulip futures were largely informal. Most contracts were written in taverns, not on the Amsterdam Exchange. They were witnessed by neighbors, recorded in notebooks, settled over drinks. This informality would matter enormously when things went wrong. Through late 1636, prices on many varieties, not just the elite broken tulips, began rising sharply. Common tulips, solid-colored and easily reproducible, got pulled into the speculation. A Switzer bulb or a Gouda variety, ordinary flowers worth a few guilders a year earlier, started changing hands for multiples of that, sometimes in the same afternoon. The mechanism here was partly psychological and partly structural. Because contracts settled in summer, a buyer in November could resell his contract in December at a higher price, without ever touching the bulb, without ever intending to. Money could be made, or appear to be made, simply by holding paper. And because entry costs were low for common varieties, people who had never traded commodities before joined in. Here is where the popular myth begins to diverge most sharply from the documented record. The standard story describes a nation gripped by tulip fever, servants mortgaging homes, chimney sweeps buying contracts, a collective madness that spread across Dutch society from top to bottom. This image comes largely from pamphlets published after the crash, written by Calvinist moralists, who were not exactly neutral observers of speculative excess. The historian Anne Goldgar, who spent years reading the actual notarial records, contracts, and correspondence, found something far more contained. The tulip market in 1636 and early 1637 involved perhaps a few hundred to a few thousand people, concentrated in specific towns, Haarlem especially, also Enkhuizen, Hoorn, and Alkmaar. These were not the destitute gambling their last coins. Most participants were middling tradespeople, cloth merchants, skilled craftsmen, small-scale dealers, people with some capital and some appetite for a market that seemed to be going one direction. The very wealthy, the great Amsterdam merchant houses, were largely not involved in the tavern futures market. They had enough information and enough distance to be skeptical. The collapse came in early February 1637, and it came quickly. The exact trigger is unclear in records, but the general picture is consistent across accounts. At a routine auction in Haarlem, buyers stopped bidding at expected prices. The room went quiet at a level no seller had prepared for. Word spread fast in the tight trading networks of the Dutch cloth and flower towns. Within days, contract holders were trying to sell and finding no buyers at any recent price. The futures market, which had no formal enforcement mechanism, simply ceased. A contract was only worth what the counterparty would honor. And many counterparties, faced with paying far more than a bulb was now worth, simply refused. Buyers argued the contracts were unenforceable, gambling debts essentially, since no exchange had recognized them. Sellers argued they were owed the agreed price. Both sides went to local authorities. The Dutch States General, confronted with a wave of disputes, issued a ruling in April 1637 that was careful, narrow, and somewhat unsatisfying to everyone involved. Contracts could be voided if the buyer paid a small percentage, roughly 3 to 5% of the original price. This was not a bailout. It was a negotiated exit that acknowledged the market had no real legal foundation. The financial ruin that followed was real, but it was not the civilizational catastrophe later accounts described. Most losses were contained within the informal tavern networks where the speculation had happened. Contracts were disputed, friendships ended. Some families took genuine hits to their savings. But there is little evidence in tax records, bankruptcy filings, or municipal accounts of the widespread destitution that the post-crash pamphlets described so vividly. The pamphlets themselves are worth examining for a moment. They appeared almost immediately after the collapse, printed in series, often anonymously. They featured characters with names like Gergiet, roughly greedy goods, and Vermont, something like true mouth, debating the madness of tulip speculation. These were moral fables dressed as economic commentary. They were enormously influential, and historians now read them as primary sources, not for what the market actually did, but for what certain Dutch Calvinist writers wanted their readers to believe about greed, vanity, and divine punishment for worldly excess. The image of the ruined chimney sweep, the servant who lost everything on a single bulb, that image came from these pamphlets, not from court records or account books. It was a useful story. It still is, which is part of why it survived 350 years largely intact. The Tulip Mania became the founding example of speculative bubbles in economic literature, largely because of one book published 2 centuries later. Charles Mackay's Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, published in 1841, took the pamphlet tradition at face value, amplified it, and gave it the authority of a printed history. Mackay did not read Dutch. He worked from secondary sources that were already working from the morality pamphlets. His chapter on Tulip Mania became the lens through which economists, journalists, and eventually textbook writers understood the 1630s Dutch market. Every subsequent bubble, from the South Sea Company to dot-com stocks to cryptocurrency, got compared to Tulip Mania, usually by people who had never examined the original sources. The comparison was rhetorically powerful and historically thin. What the Tulip episode actually demonstrates is more specific and more interesting than mass delusion. It shows what happens when a new commodity enters an existing trade culture that already knows how to write futures contracts, but has not built the institutions to enforce them. The Dutch Republic had sophisticated financial infrastructure, the Amsterdam Exchange Bank, joint stock companies, established commodity markets with real legal backing. The tulip futures market, deliberately or carelessly, operated outside all of that. Contracts written in taverns, witnessed by neighbors, with no exchange registration, no margin requirements, no clearing mechanism. That is not a functioning market. It is a network of private promises. When prices reversed, those promises had no structure to hold them. The broken tulips themselves, the Semper Augustus varieties that started the whole collecting culture, were never really part of the tavern speculation at that scale. The elite collector market for rare broken varieties continued after 1637, quietly, among people with means. What collapsed was the informal common bulb futures market that had grown around it in roughly 18 months. That distinction rarely makes it into the standard telling. By the mid-1640s, tulip growing had settled into a stable horticultural trade in the Haarlem region, one that would eventually become the foundation of the Dutch flower industry, still operating today. The bulb fields around Haarlem and Lisi exist in a direct, if long line from the 1630s trade networks. That is perhaps the least dramatic but most durable legacy of the whole episode. Not a warning about human irrationality, but a practical trade that outlasted its own mythology. The tulip craze, as it is usually told, is a story about what greed does to ordinary people. The tulip craze, as the records show it, is a story about what happens to informal markets when the legal framework that should surround them is absent. Both stories use the same flower, only one of them is asking the harder question. As with most events at this distance, details vary depending on which sources survived, which were translated, and which writers shaped the interpretation that followed. The records that exist are real. The legend that grew around them is also real, and considerably larger.